Look at a map of Canada at night from space, and you will see something that should fundamentally disturb your understanding of what a country even is. Where you expect the lights of a vast, populated nation stretching from coast to coast, you instead find a thin, fragile ribbon of brightness clinging to the southern edge of the continent. A strip of civilization no wider than a few hundred kilometers presses hard against the American border, as if the whole country were quietly trying to escape northward, but never quite managing it. Above that ribbon, stretching for thousands upon thousands of kilometers all the way to the Arctic Ocean, there is almost nothing. No cities, no highways, no farms. Just a darkness so complete, it looks less like an uninhabited country and more like open ocean. The question that should be forming in your mind right now is not merely interesting or academic. It is one of the most revealing geographical puzzles on the planet. Why does the second largest country in the world, a nation larger than the entire continental United States, larger than China, larger than Australia, have 90% of its landmass effectively empty of human beings? The scale of this emptiness is genuinely difficult to absorb. Canada is not slightly underpopulated. It is not a country with a few sparse regions and a few dense ones. It is a country where 40 million people, the entire population, have generation after generation chosen to occupy a sliver of territory that represents roughly 10% of the total land available to them. They have done this so consistently and so completely that the mathematical consequences become almost surreal when you examine them closely. Here's a fact that stops people mid-sentence when they first encounter it. Approximately half of all Americans live further north than 90% of Canadians. That means the citizens of this legendary, frozen, mythologized northern wilderness are, statistically and geographically, more southern than the population of the country they have spent 2 centuries carefully distinguishing themselves from. When that registers, when the map in your head quietly rearranges itself around that fact, the whole mythology of Canada as a conquered and inhabited north begins to feel like exactly that. A mythology, a story a country tells itself that the landscape has never quite agreed to confirm. Most people who encounter this puzzle reach immediately for the cold, and they are not wrong to do so. The winters across Canada's interior are genuinely brutal. The kind of cold that makes infrastructure expensive, makes agriculture difficult, and turns ordinary life into a serious logistical undertaking. But cold alone cannot explain what you are looking at. Siberia is cold, yet Russia has cities deep inside it. Scandinavia is cold, and Finland and Norway have pushed settlements far above the Arctic Circle. Alaska is cold, and people have found ways to live there. Cold is a cost, a serious one. But human beings have historically been willing to pay serious costs when the land beneath them offers something worth staying for. And that is precisely where Canada's story takes its first unexpected turn. The land beneath most of Canada does not offer that, not because of the temperature above it, but because of what the planet did to it roughly 2 billion years ago, and because of what the ice ages finished off more recently. Those events left behind a formation so geologically hostile to human settlement that it functions less like terrain and more like a locked door. That formation is called the Canadian Shield. To understand why Canada looks the way it does, you have to understand what the shield is and what it did to the country built on top of it. The shield is not simply a region or a zone or an area of difficult terrain. It is a 5 million square kilometer slab of some of the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth. Ancient Precambrian granite was once the roots of a mountain range comparable in size and grandeur to the Himalayas. That range spent hundreds of millions of years being pushed upward by tectonic forces, and then, with devastating thoroughness, being scraped, ground, polished, and ultimately erased by successive waves of glaciation. Each ice age sent kilometer-thick sheets of ice grinding southward across the rock, stripping away everything that had accumulated on the surface, every layer of soil, every deposit of organic material, every geological feature that might one day support agriculture or anchor a city. What remained was essentially bare stone, clean and ancient bedrock, and completely structurally inhospitable to the kind of biological activity that human civilization requires as its foundation. You cannot farm granite. You cannot grow wheat on exposed bedrock. You cannot build the agricultural surplus that every pre-industrial civilization needed before it could become something larger than a scattering of subsistence communities. Without agriculture, without surplus, without the slow accumulation of population density that farming makes possible, you cannot build cities. And without cities, you cannot build roads. Without roads, you cannot build an economy. And without an economy, there is no reason for anyone to be there at all. Which is why, when European settlers arrived and began pushing inland across North America, they followed the soil, and the soil led them south, always south, into the fertile valleys and plains below the shield. They left the rock above them to the silence it had maintained for 2 billion years. But here's where the story refuses to stay simple, because the shield that repelled settlement so completely, the rock that stripped away every incentive for human beings to remain, is not empty in the way that emptiness usually implies worthlessness. This is the detail that transforms Canada's geographical puzzle from a curiosity into something closer to a tragedy. Beneath that 5 million square kilometer slab of ancient granite, locked inside the rock itself and in the layers just below it, lies one of the most extraordinary concentrations of mineral wealth anywhere on the surface of the planet. There are gold deposits that rank among the largest ever discovered, nickel and cobalt reserves that the global technology industry increasingly cannot function without, diamond pipes scattered across the northern interior that produce some of the highest quality gemstones in the world, and uranium deposits significant enough to matter in any serious conversation about the future of nuclear energy. The combined estimated value of what sits beneath Canada's empty north runs into figures so large they become difficult to process meaningfully. Tens of trillions of dollars by some geological assessments, a treasury so vast it dwarfs the GDP of most nations. It sits untouched, largely unreachable beneath a wilderness that stubbornly and expensively resists every human attempt to extract it at scale. The reason is not only the shield itself, but something that sits on top of it and under the thin surface layer across nearly half of Canada's territory, permafrost, permanently frozen ground that never fully thaws regardless of the season. Permafrost destroys roads as reliably as it allows them to be built. It buckles rail lines, collapses foundations, and turns pipeline construction into a years-long argument with physics that the physics department usually wins. As a result, the wealth buried in Canada's north exists in a state of cruel proximity, close enough to identify, measure, estimate, and covet, yet behind a barrier of geology and climate. Making access consistent, reliable, and economically viable is a problem engineers have been working on for a century without fully solving, and every year the permafrost reminds them why. It is this combination, the shield that emptied the north of people, the permafrost that locked away the wealth beneath it, that produced the consequence which ultimately defines what Canada is as a political and economic entity. A country that cannot populate its interior and cannot easily extract what that interior contains is a country that cannot build the East-West economic relationships that give large nations their structural independence. It cannot move goods across its own landmass with the kind of efficiency that makes domestic markets self-sustaining. It cannot avoid the gravitational pull of the enormous economy directly to its south. So, Canada, the second largest country on Earth, a nation that stretches wider than the distance from London to Baghdad, has organized its entire economic life along a narrow north-south axis pointing directly into the United States, sending the overwhelming majority of its exports southward across a single border. depending on American markets and American supply chains and American trade policy in ways that no country of Canada's theoretical size and resource wealth should ever need to depend on anyone. The Trans-Canada Railway, that legendary feat of 19th century engineering that blasted through the Shield with dynamite, determination, and the lives of thousands of workers, was built precisely because the founders of the country understood that without some artificial east-west connection imposed on a landscape that provided none naturally, the Western territories would simply drift into the American economic orbit, and the country would dissolve before it had properly begun. Canada, as a unified nation, is not a geographical fact, but an act of political will, maintained in permanent tension with geography. It exists because people decided it should exist, and have been spending money and energy ever since to keep the landscape from proving them wrong. Perhaps that is the most honest and unsettling thing you can say about Canada. Its vastness, the very quality that makes it look so powerful, sovereign, and self-sufficient on a map, is precisely the quality that has always made it vulnerable. The emptiness is not a blank page waiting to be written on. It is a geological argument 2 billion years in the making, and so far, the rock is winning.